Well, we're squeezing in one last episode here before the new year. What do we got? Like less than 48 hours now till New
Yep.
Year's.
Coming up on it. It's been a minute since we've done an actual podcast, but through the holidays, it's just kind of hard to link up with people. And yeah, we're back
Yeah,
at it, so I'm ready to go and jump in and got some exciting things for next year coming up around the corner as well.
yeah, some stuff planned. People are busy, people are traveling. I know Evan, you went to your wife's family in Georgia, and you were gone for a handful of days. And we were originally going to record this uh, last week, but our
I think
guest
so.
went under the weather a little bit, pushed it out. Luckily, we were able to squeeze it in here before the new year turns over. And before I let Evan introduce our guest today, which you can probably already see him sitting there hanging out because the logo's gone now, but. Welcome, everyone, to the Aged Out Podcast. I'm one of your hosts, Mike Fantini, and with me, as always, is...
Evan Worrell.
And if you're listening on podcast services, go check out the YouTube channel. We have all kinds of other content there. If you're on the YouTube channel, you want to listen in the car stuff. We're on Spotify, Google Podcasts, Apple Podcasts, all that good stuff. Check us out on social media. Never miss an update or new episode or new content we release. Facebook, Instagram, it's just Aged Out Podcast. And go to patreon.com/Aged Out Podcast if you want to support us financially at all. Now I can take a deep breath. Evan, I'll let you take it, and we'll just get into this thing and see where it goes.
Boom. So yeah, joining us, you can see from the title, a gentleman that I've spent a couple long, grueling, and successful summers with. But Lee Beddis, welcome, man. Thanks for hanging out.
Hey, thanks for having me, guys.
Yeah, the man
Pleasure to be
way
here.
up north. You just got drilled with cold weather and like negative 45-degree wind chills, but you're probably like laughing at us Southerners, like, what?
It was cold here too. Same thing. Although it's snapped the last couple of days now, and yeah, last week I was very much under the weather. I was in bed for like a good 24 to 32 hours, I think, probably.
That's never
Well,
fun.
you look great now. You look healthy. You sound healthy. We're glad that we can make it work. And
Awesome.
we snapped too. We went from like -6 to today it was like 66. So
Yeah, it
whatever.
was wild within like a day or two. There's the weather. We always end up on the weather at the beginning of these somehow. It always comes up. I purposefully avoided it at the beginning. Now this
It's
one's
always
on you,
topical.
Evan, not me.
It's always topical, but
Well,
yeah, man.
being Canadian, I always hear the weather. So
Yeah. But
Fair
we're
enough.
glad to have the Canadian in the house, which
yeah,
is kind of fascinating because as we were talking about before we even started, you said that there's not really a startup in Canada the way that we have in the States. So
yeah.
dude, how did you get into drum corps and how did that just start your long, illustrious career?
Yeah. So I mean, basically, we were at school. I was at school, and this organization came around to each of the classrooms. I was in grade 4 back then, so I would have been 9 years old, probably. Right? Is that about right?
Sounds
And
right.
and they came around, and they were like, "Hey, we happen to practice at this school every Tuesdays and Sundays, something like that." And I lived right around the corner from the school, and I came home and I told my parents, I'm like, hey, I'd like to go check this out on Tuesday night. And that was it, man. I went to my first rehearsal and I was hooked right into it. I played, and in Canada, we don't really have any high school bands for the most part. Or even any marching bands. That's definitely not a thing up here. It's more independent groups. And back then we had a bunch of little drum corps, and much like the U.S. did as well, right? There was all these little drum corps all over the place. And that's kind of where I started. Yeah.
I saw somebody recently made like a chart graph of how many active corps there were over
Yeah.
years from like 1960 to current. In one year there was like 100, and I was like,
Yeah.
what? But
Right.
I mean that makes sense. There were so many, like you're talking about little pockets of corps, Div 1, Div
Right.
2, Div 3 back then.
And very regional too, right? There was a bunch like in my area that I grew up in, Peterborough, Ontario. There was 3 groups right in that little area, So that was cool. So I played cymbals for the first couple of years, and then as I watched the snare drummers play on my cymbals or whatever back then, I would then pick up the sticks and try to emulate whatever the hell they were trying to do, right? So that's kind of how I learned. It was all by rote for the most part.
Yeah, that's pretty impressive. I mean, that reminds me too of like, I mean, you see videos of like little 5, 6-year-old kids. I mean, they're just emulating, and it makes sense. Did you have
Sponges.
anyone in that pocket or area that kind of facilitated or influenced or mentored you to help you kind of cultivate those skills, or was it just kind of like, let's see how I can do this myself?
Sorry, you cut out there. One more time.
Was there anyone that like kind of helped facilitate or mentor your learning?
Oh yeah. Back then, my early days, I had the privilege of being taught by the Blanford family, and it was Larry and Mark, and then his brother. I marched with the brother Scott, and learned a ton of different things back then. You know, just through, and they were they came from the Seneca Optimist and the Oakland Crusaders back then. I don't know if you've ever heard of those names, but
I've heard
like
Oakland Crusaders, but never the first one.
yeah, like Tom Float taught the Oakland Crusaders, so there was some lineage there on what he taught them, got taught to me as well at the same time in the early '80s. And it was always chops first. That's kind of how I learned how to play. I played on a pillow, learned how to play all control, especially with Mylar heads back then, and everything was about control and chops. You know,
Dude,
so it was
oh,
a lot of fun growing up.
Dude, if you got chops, you can figure out a lot of stuff.
It's a good foundation place to start. But were you ever involved with Dutch Boy at all?
Yeah. So after I did 2 years at the Crescendos, and then 2 years at the Canadian Knights back then in my area, in the Peterborough area, and then the Blanfords moved to the Dutch Boy back in '83, and I ended up marching Dutch Boy for the next 4 years, '83 through '86.
Oh wow.
And we had some great staffs back then too that came through, including Glenn Crosby came through and taught there for a year, and Rick Gallagher I had, a guy March 27th, and of course the Blanfords were there my first year. Gus Barbero, remember him? Gus Barbero came and
I've
taught.
heard the name.
Yeah, he came and taught in '83. But yeah, a bunch of guys kind of came through that program. It was pretty neat.
I was curious because I've known two people that started at Dutch Boy, and then so the guy that I said before we started recording, the guy that taught me how to drum was a cadet in the early '90s. He had marched Dutch Boy the summer before, so there was a handful of Moorhead State guys. I think JJ Pipitone ended up marching Dutch Boy before.
I marched with JJ. I marched with JJ in '86. He actually played snare. He came and marched snare with us.
Nice.
Well, so I used to give him hell all the time because he wasn't the best snare drummer, but he was an amazing tenor drummer, right?
Yeah. So DeMond got cut from the cadets going up there with Eric Ward in '93, and then so Pipitone was at Moorhead with them, so he was like, dude, just come march Dutch Boy this summer. So DeMond went up to Dutch Boy with him, and then he ended up making cadets in '94 with Eric the following summer, and then another Dutch Boy connection, guy Brandon Mooney marched Blue Stars with me for Unks in 2010. He was a Dutch Boy kid. Yeah. He marched Dutch Boy and then came down to Indianapolis for auditions and stuff. And so I feel like Dutch Boy has like fingers everywhere throughout the U.S. drum corps activity, just feeding people from Canada all over the place.
That's kind of ironic, that story about JJ too, like getting moved to tenors. I've heard another story about like a BD tenor player, and I think it was Sean Vega. Somebody told me that he had like originally tried out for bass drum, and they're like, no, and then like played tenors and was like, all right, or something. I don't know if that's true, but someone can validate that out there.
Well, it's funny. I remember the year in '86. He would practice his individuals all year on tenor, and we'd be like, what is this guy doing? He's a snare drummer. And we get to individuals, and he wins individuals.
That's hilarious.
What are you doing all summer, man?
Yeah. That's awesome.
Dude, yeah. So tallying those up, that means you had 8 summers or 8 seasons. I don't know if it's full summers or what, but 8 seasons before your last 4 that you spent at cadets.
Yeah. By the time I went to cadets, I went to the Garfield cadets back then. In 1987, I was 17, and I already had 6 years of experience on snare drum, pretty much, coming in there.
It's crazy.
And I had a ton of experience coming in, right? And it was fun.
It's obviously a very iconic summer, a very iconic show, Appalachian Spring, fantastic music, very iconic line. And did you all kind of know early on that they were kind of, it seemed like they were taking a different approach as far as like the normal thing, like, hey, we're not going to do the whole bring the drums up front and have the big long drum solo. It seemed to be the style back then, but we're just going to be super musical and run and gun, and like this is going to be us. Did it feel different at all, or were you just kind of like
quite honestly, when my first year there, I was barely hanging on to the rails. Man, it was like we worked the work ethic, and still to this day, I suppose, with the cadets. But the work ethic that I learned that summer was my foundation of actually really teaching later on. But yeah, I honestly, Hannum's approach back then was about the music, right? It's about the music. It wasn't about here, bring the drum line up and crank and do this. It was all about how it fit into the show. And we just bought in, and nobody questioned anything back then. It was like, we just bought in 100% and just do our jobs, and that's what we did every day. We had that lunch pail mentality every day. Put the drum on, go. Here we go, and we had such faith that if we do this well, then things will be paid off to us, right? And ended up, obviously, it did.
That's a common thing that I've heard talking to various people that have either been a part of like drum trophy winning lines or teaching drum trophy winning lines. They're just very adamant about nobody really thought too hard about it. We, like you just said, like a lunch pail group, just like wake up every day, go to work, don't think too hard, do your job, like. Yeah. I don't want to say no drama throughout a summer because it's a long tour. People are going to get on each other's nerves sometimes. But, like, you just go do your job. You just go get it done. Let the staff do their thing if you're a member and vice versa. Trust the members if you're a staff and just go after it, and good things are going to happen.
Yeah, trust the process, Trust the process. Go through, do what you need to do. I mean, even coming off the finals field, we were still like, man, I wish I would have done it. We were just so constantly caught up into how to be perfect all the time and how can we get better? We were just constantly driven that way all the way.
Did you all play Frisbee finals day?
No.
Is that where your brain was going, Evan?
No, but I do remember Tom Monk's telling that story about, he said that he was just like, I was trying to drill the drum line. And like, Hannah was like, dude, they got it. Just let them chill out for a second. Like, let them play some Frisbee or something.
I do remember the week of finals. Tom was the only guy pretty much who did the whole tour. It was just him. I think Steve Kiefer was our bass guy. And then we have, I think we had one or two other guys who kind of floated in and out. But Tom was with us from the beginning of move-ins through to finals. So Hannum needed to really separate him sometimes, like get away from them.
Go take a break. Take a break. Yeah.
Here's a bottle of Jack. Go sit under that tree over there. Leave me alone.
That's awesome.
Because Tom, he was literally up our butts every day, every minute of every rehearsal, pretty much. And I got to tell you, again, talking about that work ethic, that's where I learned that from. That's my foundation of how I ended up teaching later on. Well, to this day,
We always knew at Stars in 2010 when Tom came out to battery sectionals and he was the one running it, not the techs. We knew it was like, all right, we're gonna get our butts kicked right now. Get ready. Drink some extra water before the block starts.
Right.
That was one thing that I always enjoyed about, because you didn't always run the sectionals at Crown when you were there.
Right.
A lot of that was Zach, and then that summer with Jeff Brooks. But there, every now and then you would like get out and you'd be at the snare sectionals, and it was just a good change of pace because the rehearsals were always so fast paced because you didn't talk a lot. You were just like, you played that wrong, reset, go back, like reset, go back, reset, go back. Like, but it really allows you to build momentum and consistency. Not just because you're doing the reps over and over, but I always felt like, we're doing these reps so quick behind each other. This is actually how I feel in the middle of the show. When I'm 5 minutes in, I didn't get a 2-minute break before I did this rep because that's what I don't get that in the show. It's just go back, do it again, go back, do it again. And your heart rate's just jacked. But when you figure out how to do it that way, you learn to control that.
Yeah, and things slow down for you in the actual show when it actually happens. It actually slows down for you, right?
Yeah.
Yeah, I learned all that from Hannum and Unks pretty much. Hannum was the guy who came in and he wrote the beats, but he would also take over rehearsal, very disciplined rehearsal. And then Tom would be all over us in terms of work ethic and just a great cleaner all those years. I had
Reset,
great
out of set.
opportunities. Yeah,
Reset,
between
out
the
of
two
set.
of them, 87 and 88 with Hannum, and then Unks took over in 89. And 89 is one of my fun years of cadets. I consider it fun. Half the snare line was Canadian, so we used to have these Canada-USA wars during the day, like who would tick the most or who would not tick, and the Canadians always won. I gotta tell you.
That's awesome. Yeah, I mean, you had the 4 great years at Cadets. Obviously, success in a competitive aspect in 2 of those from 87 and 90. Was 90 the Stonehenge show?
No, 90 was Best of Bernstein.
Oh, Stonehenge was like 98, 99. But yeah.
That was much later.
Yeah, much later. But first place in 87, first place in 90, and also Fred Sanford winners both those years, if I remember.
Yep.
But yeah, well, what you described as your 87 year is kind of how I always felt about my 09 Crown Summer. That was my first year doing drum corps ever. And I didn't really realize how hard it was because I just assumed that it was supposed to be that hard because that's all I knew.
Right.
After the summer, I was like, man, your guys' show was so hard. You're just running. I was like, I mean, I knew it was hard, but I just thought that's what everybody was doing. I don't know. This is what people 40 years before me have been doing. So here I am doing it. This is what I signed up for.
Well, you guys, and I remember 09 Crown. I mean, you guys trusted the process for the most part, and we put the grind on the whole summer with you guys, every rehearsal,
Plus, I had a chip on my shoulder because I was the second to last snare drummer contracted. So I was like, no, I got to prove it.
You're going to prove it. You're going to prove us, right?
Yeah, I'm like, all right, I'm prove it.
Yeah, that's awesome.
But so you have obviously this killer experience with some well-known legends, and you're just soaking up all this rehearsal and how to do things. Did you start teaching right after your age out in 1990? Your first year, 91, you signed up with somebody?
I did, yes. So the Madison Scouts, I started teaching. That was my first round with the Madison Scouts, 91 and 92. And so Chris Thompson, who was running the Madison Scouts at the time, percussion director, he was great friends with Hannum. They marched together. I think they marched together at the Crossman and taught together at the Crossman back in the late 70s, early 80s, before they kind of split off. And so Hannum recommended me to Chris CT over at Madison. That's when I started teaching there. So those are pretty good lines too. 91, 92 at Madison. Some good things.
I'm actually not very familiar with those years, but I will be after this. I'll go check it out. I love.
It was the City of Angels. If you know the City of Angels, both those years. Okay. Now in 92, I only taught up to about May because real life set in. I actually got it. That was my first time. I graduated college in 91, and I got a job offer that had to start in May of that year. So I couldn't go on tour. Actually, I was able to do probably about 5 weeks on tour, but that wasn't good enough for them. They wanted back then, you did the full tour. It was like,
you're doing stagger the staff like they do now.
Yeah, usually. It's quite a far cry from that.
It's all teaching by committee nowadays, right?
Yeah, I have some questions about that.
Yeah, we can talk about that.
I actually read about that just for obviously the current, and there's a bunch of complain on the staffs have 50 people. It's like, well, they're not there all the summer.
Yeah, that's right. Yeah.
So you went to Madison, then you ended up first year at Star was what?
93 was the Star year, and again, Tom Hannum, talked to Hannum in the wintertime, and was really there to add support. Come in, and I was going to teach. They had the flub section that year, and then be a snare tech once in a while, and then I ended up teaching more snare that summer. That's why I met Colin. Him and I got to be good friends that summer, and kind of being the young guys on the staff. And he just aged out the year before, and I was 2 years removed. So had a great year in 93, and then Star went to the Brass Theater in 94, and I remember at the time was my wife happened to be marching the Phantom Regiment. And so I would, in 92, in that summer, I would actually go home. Yeah, my wife.
Was
Yeah,
she?
it wasn't. Well, in '92, I got married in '93. So in '92, she was marching Phantom because I was teaching at Madison. So the whole idea was we could hook up on Sundays of move-ins because Rockford and Madison were like, a couple hours away from each other. So that was the idea. So
That's an
needless to
amazing
say,
story.
so I would come around in '92 because I was working back then. So, but I still come and kind of hang out with her on tour. I would sleep in my car basically and kind of hang out with her. And I would be around Phantom's rehearsals. And I wouldn't be going to watch the color guard. I would go and watch the drumline playing, right?
Yeah.
And that's
course.
where I got to know Jeff Prospery. So Jeff Prospery was running the drumline back then. And got to be friends with him because he would pick my brain as I'm sitting there. He'd be like, "Hey, what do you think of that?" I'm like, "Oh, I think the left hand was a little slow there." Whatever, And then so we got to strike up a friendship, and really in '94, after the start went to Breast Theater, he asked me to come and help out at Phantom, at the Phantom Regiment. So that's kind of where I ended up. I did, I don't know, probably 5 weeks that summer, I think.
All right, so you did 5 weeks in '94, and then did that ramp up '95, '96?
Yeah, so '95, Jeff made me caption manager or caption head back then, battery caption head, and with JJ, actually JJ Pipitone was there at the time, and Frank Chappell. That's where I met Frank Chappell.
Frank.
And Al Dunn, yeah. And Frank's still with me after all these years. So crazy. Anyways, that's where we kind of had that team. And then '96, they gave me the opportunity to write. So I wrote the battery. That was my first year writing, was the Defiant Heart.
I did not know that. What an iconic show.
Yeah.
Yeah.
Dude, I love Shostakovich so much. I just imagine writing to him because it's just, it's so dark and it's so aggressive and just like deep and heavy. Yeah.
That was a lot of fun that summer. Again, building upon the work ethic that I learned at the cadets and just continued on, with the Phantom Regiment and learning that at work ethic at the time. And the funny thing that year too, with those guys, so Tim Fairbanks marched that drum line, and a bunch of other guys too. And the reason I say Tim is because we teach together now still, and
Right.
I actually, I judge a lot of his lines during that year. I started up an indoor line back then, the Phantom Regiment indoor line. It was like the Weeders, I think, was the name of it way back then.
Yes.
And so my idea was I can actually have the same guys for 12 months, right? Have them for all winter and then have them all summer. And, it's going to pay off in the summer for us. And that's what '96 was we had most of those guys in that drum line all the way through. Yeah, it's pretty cool.
And that was kind of the beginning of the end for collegiate PASIC lines. Because people started to do that. They're like, we can get our guys together independently and we can drum, and the WGI circuit kind of started to pick up more and more because in the early '90s, and then I would even say to '98, '99, it was still indoor was pretty heavily involved with PASIC and UNT, Moorhead.
Yeah.
A lot of
there was a struggle right between the concert season and marching season, and that was still kind of alive. But yeah, we'd started, all these little independent drum lines started to show up there those years, and that was one of them. I used to drive to Rockford every weekend. It's like a 9 hour, about 9 hours for
Oh
me,
my
every
God.
weekend. Yeah,
That's that's how you know you're passionate about something. You will drive 9 hours every weekend to do it.
I think
crazy.
that's also a testament to the gas prices now versus them.
That's a very true statement.
Very true. Yeah.